Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our Opioid Documents in Action webinar, a Q&A discussion with Antoine Lentacker about his article using the Opioid Industry Document Archive. I am Richard Del Rio, a research associate in the Department of History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and I'll be moderating our conversation today. I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar will be recorded. Links to the recording will be posted on our website and shared to our email list. Um, the Opioid Documents Archive, or OIDA, is a groundbreaking digital archive of more than 6 million documents, arising from the opioid industry that advances understanding of the root causes of the epidemic and helps address corporate behavior that is harmful to public health. It's the winner of the Society of American Archivists Archival Innovator Award and co-created by the University of California, San Francisco and Johns Hopkins University. The archive serves as a living repository of information that can be used to learn from the opioid epidemic so as to improve and safeguard public policy and public health, and to ensure that the opioid-related harms that have taken place never occur again. OIDA, excuse me, gotta move my slide here. OIDA is a public archive created and funded in part through settlements of public interest lawsuits filed by states. I think it's important to note that the views expressed by today's presenters do not represent the views of the University of California, San Francisco, or of Johns Hopkins University. We would like to acknowledge the millions of Americans who have been personally impacted by the crisis, as well as to recognize the attorneys general and many other parties whose vision and commitment to transparency and accountability has made the archive possible. We're developing this digital archive and its supporting resources for the benefit of the public, including individuals, communities, researchers, and journalists and policymakers and others affected by the crisis. OIDA and its services are freely available to all. We strive to ensure that OIDA serves as a trusted source of information to help people understand the United States opioid crisis. Excuse me. Indeed, there are many stories to tell from the OIDA documents, from marketing tactics to abatement strategies to policymaking and much more. We expect the archive to support research looking back at the crisis and helping to formulate systemic change to prevent future harms to the public health. To that end, the OIDA team is creating a number of resources to help with further explanation, teaching, and mining the archive. For example, we're currently introducing an opioid crisis timeline. Excuse me, I went too far, I believe. No, here we go. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Um, an opioid crisis timeline, a a excuse me, um, opioid crisis timeline, a curriculum library, a data toolbox. I just want to make sure I include everything. An OIDA image collection and a redesigned website. These resources provide archive visitors with footholds and tools for research, data analysis, and other forms of exploration and discovery. We're glad to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Antoine Lentacker. He is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Riverside. His research interests include the history of drugs and the pharmaceutical industry in Europe and the United States. His work has appeared in Social Studies of Science, the Journal of Modern History and Representations, among others. His involvement in efforts to advocate for the public disclosure of the opioid litigation documents goes back to the summer of 2019, when he set out to draft an amicus brief that called for the inclusion of broad transparency provisions in any settlement of the ongoing opioid lawsuits. A reflection piece on that effort appeared in the spring 2021 issue of the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs under the title The Opioid Documents, a report on the politics of the public record, which is a text I highly recommend to everyone. He is also a member of OIDA's National Advisory Committee. Neither I nor our speakers report conflicts of interest related to our research for what we're presenting during this webinar. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lentacker so he can share a presentation about his excellent publication.
Good. I hope everyone can see my my screen.
Yep, we can.
Great, wonderful. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Richard, for the kind words of introduction. Thanks to everyone here for taking an interest in our research. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So let me open things up with a few words about the piece, especially perhaps for those who didn't yet have a chance to spend time with it. I'll pull up just a handful of the documents we used in writing it and say a few words about them. So the article is based on the Mallinckrodt collection, which comprises about 1.4 million documents and was very much the first comprehensive, large, substantial collection to be of internal opioid industry documents to be released and to be added onto OIDA. And I found the collection very interesting because up to that point, so much of the attention had been focused on Purdue Pharma and its infamous owners, the Sackler family. And there were good reasons, of course, to focus on them. The aggressive marketing of OxyContin by the company undoubtedly seeded the opioid crisis, the epidemic, starting in the late 1990s. But the reality is that at the height of the prescription opioid crisis, so the years around, sort of the decade around 2010, approximately, Purdue was no longer the only or even the main supplier of opioid pills. It had been taken over by these less well-known companies, and Mallinckrodt, here referred to as Spec GX, which is the generics division of Mallinckrodt, had taken over Purdue. As you can see here on the graph, Purdue in 2006-2012 only accounted for 3.3% of the number of pills supplied in the US, number of opioid pills, so far behind Spec GX or Actavis and these other less well-known companies. And so that raises an important question. If indeed Purdue had planted the seed, so to speak, why was it allowed to blossom, to take root, and to grow to this extraordinarily destructive extent? Clearly, it fell on fertile soil. The general climate, environment were favorable ones. And so to understand why the crisis could reach the proportions it did, it certainly is very important to look beyond the role of a single company, however important it was. And certainly the role of these other somewhat nameless and faceless companies that supplied the bulk of opioid pills at the height of the crisis has to be brought into focus as well. Now, by the time we started working with the Mallinckrodt documents, the company was not entirely unknown. So here, this one email by Mallinckrodt salesman, Victor Borelli, in which he infamously compared oxycodone pills to Doritos, had been reported on in the news in 2019, so about 10 years after it was written, as part of litigation documents that were unsealed following a lawsuit by the Washington Post. And a journalist, and especially at the Washington Post, played a key role in putting together the first long-form, well-researched reports about the company. And then there was also the work of the lawyers who built the case against the company. They had the earliest and broadest access to the company's internal documents and the motions and complaints they filed. So here is one of them, the one filed by the state of New Hampshire, where alongside with the reports of investigative journalists, the first drafts of the story of Mallinckrodt's role in the opioid crisis. Now, as helpful and important as these contributions were, they certainly were very helpful when we started working with the Mallinckrodt documents. lawyers and journalists come to the story from their particular perspectives. They tend to focus on the lawless or the sensational, so to speak, on what is likely to interest the courts or the general public, on the other hand. And so I felt that the main task for us researchers was to try to broaden the lens beyond the most egregious examples of lawlessness or the most glaringly unethical behavior. There surely was plenty of that in the opioid crisis, there's no doubt about it, but it would be misrepresenting the crisis to suggest that it was due solely to corrupt or deviant behavior in an otherwise sound medical ecosystem. The crisis was also a product of the ordinary operations of our medical markets, of business as usual, in a commercial and regulatory environment that is ill-designed to safeguard patient safety. So it should be our goal, I think, to try to bring to light these systemic issues or these design flaws as much as the obvious wrongdoing that in the end was responsible for the staggering loss of life caused by the crisis. And that's what we intended to do here in this article with this idea, this concept of data diversion. The phrase obviously is derived from that of drug diversion, and drug diversion is a well-defined legal category. Drug diversion occurs when controlled substances spill out of the legitimate distribution channels and end up in the hands of someone other than their intended distributors or recipients, and are then used in illicit ways. And that's precisely what the Controlled Substances Act is meant to prevent and punish when it does occur. Data diversion, by contrast, is not a legal category. It's a concept we coined to try to understand the scale of drug diversion during the opioid crisis. And its point was to draw attention to the degree to which the prescription drug markets, and especially the market for controlled substances, is saturated with data that are originally produced by the normal operations of the market for business administration or for regulatory purposes, but are then recycled and repurposed to increase sales and bypass regulatory safeguards. And we paid attention to two categories of data in particular, which I think played important roles. They were respectively in the brand name division of Mallinckrodt and in its generics division. So in the article, we focused first on prescription data. When physicians or healthcare practitioners write prescriptions, those prescriptions are brought to the pharmacy, they're filled at the pharmacy, and the pharmacy produces records on the orders and the sales. And then pharmacies in the US sell these records to data brokers, to companies specializing in collecting such records. They're known as healthcare or health information companies, health information organizations. And those brokers compile the data, make it searchable. So the data are sold just removing the identity of the patients. So they're anonymized. The patient's identity is removed. Then once the data are compiled and sold to manufacturers, they allow manufacturers to look up when and how much a particular physician prescribes their product, or other products for that matter. You can also see how much a particular prescriber prescribes products from your competitors. And the dominant company in this field is IMS Health. The company was actually created in the 1950s. It's been buying billing records from pharmacies since the 1950s. And it was created actually by Arthur Sackler, the patriarch of the Sackler dynasty, so to speak. Now, the use of IMS data to inform the work of detailing, the work of drug reps, is rather well known. And it's been scrutinized and criticized for at least about a couple decades now. And so the main contribution of OIDA here, of the documents we looked at, I think, is to allow for a richer, a more precise description of the role, the concrete ways in which data inform the work of detailing, of drug marketing, and also, in fact, to show the specific consequences, specific ways in which this plays out in the opioid field, as opposed to field of prescription drugs generally. And in the case of opioids, the data were used by sales teams to direct marketing resources, to kind of train the marketing firepower on very high volume prescribers, on doctors who prescribe really anomalously, inordinately high amounts of high volumes of opioids, although not necessarily a Mallinckrodt opioid. So that was the goal was to identify those high prescribers and persuade them or kind of shift them into prescribing a Mallinckrodt sort of brand name products. And so that here, for instance, is an email of a conversation about one of these very high volume prescribers, Dr. Gossi, Eugene Gossi. He was actually the highest C2 prescriber of classified like sort of Schedule II drugs in New York State, and actually one of the very largest in the nation. And he was assiduously courted by Mallinckrodt, but he was also being investigated, and that's mentioned here in the email, right? He seems to be under a bit of scrutiny, says the email, but then the email, continues on. He defends his position well. He's very committed to treating patients with pain and seems to be a man of high integrity. And so, they went on trying to persuade him to switch to Mallinckrodt products. Actually, just a few years later, he was indicted on healthcare fraud counts, more than 100 counts of healthcare fraud and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. And he's just one of many examples. I mean, the pattern repeats itself over and over, where these doctors who end up, facing charges are always end up being the ones that have most aggressively been courted by Mallinckrodt and its competitors. So with the second category of data, we explored the so-called chargeback data. We definitely advanced into more uncharted territory. So here, maybe I have to explain just a little bit more. So most of the attention in research and the press coverage has gone to the marketing of drugs, the detailing of drugs, to healthcare professionals, to prescribers. Drug reps typically are deployed to detail newer brand name, patent-protected products, like OxyContin in its time, or Exalgo, products like that for Mallinckrodt, because these products can command high prices and therefore yield higher returns on the marketing investment. Now, with Mallinckrodt, in fact, the bulk of opioid pills sold by the company were generics. They were not these brand name products. So they were the products sold through its subsidiary, SpecGX. And these generic opioids were approved by the FDA. I think the first one for the kind of delayed action opioid was 2003. And they allowed for a dramatic expansion of the opioid supply at the height of the opioid crisis. And the marketing of generics is an entirely different exercise from the marketing of these brand name products. The goal with generics is not to create demand for a new product, but to meet demand that's already existing, that's already been created by the brand, and to meet it at the most competitive price. And so as a result, generic products are not marketed to prescribers, they're marketed to wholesalers and distributors. Because the situation is, when you have different generics, the same generic produced by different companies, a pharmacy doesn't need to have, it needs one generic version of, oxycodone 10 milligram, oxycodone 30 milligram, whether it's the Mallinckrodt version, the activist version, doesn't really make a difference. And so as a result, wholesalers typically try to contract with one generic manufacturer, a small number of them, who can provide them with a broad range, kind of a coherent line of different products, and can provide it to them at the best price and with the best service. And so the main tool for generic manufacturers to get those contracts with distributors are rebates, discounts on the price. And the system used throughout the industry was to actually sell the drugs at the regular catalog price, but then to promise discounts and to agree on discounts that are paid out once the drugs are sold on to retailers, to pharmacies, clinics, who then deliver them to patients. And to claim those discounts or to charge them back to the kind of manufacturer, the distributors have to provide sales records, their transaction data, in which they detail how much of the product they provide to every one of the retailers, the pharmacies, the clinics, and so on. And those are the chargeback data, these detailed transaction data. And so as a result of this system, the effect of this system is that when drugs flow down the supply line, when they flow from the manufacturer to the distributors, to the retailers, the pharmacies, the clinics, data move back up the supply line through the distributor and back to the manufacturer. And thanks to these so-called chargeback data, Mallinckrodt gained knowledge not only on their own direct customers, the distributors, the wholesalers, but also on their customers' customers. They could track the movement of their product all the way down to its final retail point. And this chargeback data could have been very helpful in spotting likely diversion, in identifying clinics or pharmacies who sold opioids in suspicious amounts or suspicious patterns that were likely to indicate diversion. And this is just the last couple documents I want to show. This is what's going on here. In this email, so again, Victor Borelli, whom I mentioned, is involved here. And he was actually employed in the generics division of Mallinckrodt. And here you see one of his clients, or one of the people at the distributor who mentions an account in Florida, a pharmacy. It was called here Pharmco. And it was buying, he's telling Borelli, this pharmacy is buying huge amounts of your product, much larger amounts than it used to. And then he's asking, can you check the chargebacks for me to tell me what the total usage is? And essentially what they're asking is they're buying a lot of products from us, but are they also buying products from other wholesalers? They know how much product, the pharmacy is buying from them. Are they also buying from other manufacturers? And so, they provide the DEA number, and with the DEA number, the chargeback reports can be searched. And here, Borelli gets in touch with the person compiling the record, and indeed it shows here that that same pharmacy is buying products from more than one distributor. And typically a pharmacy buying products from more than one distributor is a red flag, because they typically split the orders between different wholesalers if they want to buy usual amounts without triggering the suspicious order detection system of any one of their providers. And so, but again, thanks to the chargeback data collected from every wholesaler it sells to, Mallinckrodt is able to see the full list of wholesalers where a pharmacy buys its products. And so with respect to its own products, the manufacturer knows more about the clients of the wholesalers than the wholesalers themselves do, thanks to this transaction data. Now, given this information, KeySource should have suspended, logically, the provision of drugs to this pharmacy. Borelli should have notified the other wholesalers who were also selling products to this pharmacy, and they should have reported it to the DEA. Those are the responsibilities of manufacturers under the Controlled Substances Act. And you can see here in the email that is definitely not what happens. On the contrary, Borelli says, let's be silent about this situation, which benefits both you and me. Because for KeySource, it's useful commercial intelligence on the state of business between its clients and its competitors. It's also possibly useful information if a DEA investigation enforcement action may be coming with respect to this pharmacy. They can take precautions. And for Borelli, providing the intel, based on the chargeback data is also a way to strengthen his relationship with a good client. And in return, actually, the favor sort of is returned by his contact at KeySource, who tell him also that KeySource are starting to buy product from a competitor, Actavis. Okay, so you see that here, where the favor is returned. And so I think that's kind of a striking illustration of the ways in which data that were generated originally for the purpose of monitoring and regulating the pharmaceutical supply chain, and especially supply of controlled substances, are recycled by drug companies for the opposite purpose of spiking sales and evading regulatory safeguards. So unlike, just as a word of conclusion, unlike drug diversion, data diversion is not in itself illegal. On the contrary, it pervades the pharmaceutical economy. It's definitely the lifeblood of the marketing of drugs. And in describing its role in the unfolding of the opioid crisis, we wanted to make a case that the medical data economy deserves perhaps more attention than it's gotten so far in prescription drug policy and health policy generally. And I think that OIDA is an exceptional resource to try to make that case. Thank you, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for telling us about this striking research. I am curious to know. I have wanted to formulate some questions while everyone else has a chance to kind of digest what you said. I think that this research really highlights how popular policy discourse surrounding the public health challenges of an opioid crisis needs to shift away from the seedy and sometimes sensationalized aspects of the street market for narcotics and push more for more attention and scholarship on what at first glance seems to be the kind of mundane and superficially innocuous activities of the drug industry. I think this article is a great overview of the different factors of drug marketing in the 21st century, and I think you put together a great compact teaching tool for students interested in a multiple professional and academic disciplines interested in the patterns of a drug crisis. I have two questions for you, and then we'll give it to the audience. My first question falls within the field of history, and it's historiographical. Does this contribution and this story of the infrastructure and economy of data in the 21st century drug business open any possibilities for interventions or amendments in what historians have known in the past about the so-called career cycles of drugs, specifically psychotropic and addictive drugs? When I'm thinking of career cycle, I'm thinking of the Sieg cycles that Toyn Peters and Stephen Snelding have identified, in which a drug expands in use, has high expectations, and then there's a rise in criticism and disappointment, and subsequently there's a contraction of use and application. My second question would be, your article describes a system that in many ways has delegated market participants to monitor themselves and flag issues for state authorities. The details being collected to prevent crisis was diverted for the purpose of growing market share and earning commissions, which ultimately propagated crisis across a multitude of American communities. All this through the power of amassed, granular, and responsive proprietary data. So my question is, and at the risk of committing social science blasphemy, should this drug data be placed under a scheduling regime itself? What kind of remedy, safeguard, or maybe compensatory mechanisms do you think people in researching policy should explore? And those, I think we could start with that, and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Richard. Yes, these are two substantial questions. So, as far as how this could fit in a longer history of drugs and data, I mean, that's exactly what my work is concerned with. And in fact, I'm not originally a specialist of the opioid crisis or even of the modern U.S. drug markets. Primarily, and by training, in fact, a 19th century European historian of science and of medicine, pharmacy in 19th century Europe. And actually, I'm at work on a book that tries to describe the effects of the formation of mass media in the kind of turn of the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century on the distribution of drugs on prescribers and prescription drugs. So yes, I think I suppose what I'm trying to show in the book and is obviously that, as you said, there's these cycles in which new substances get introduced and spread sort of beyond their intended uses, and then there's certainly, with respect to opioids, a cycle like that which takes place in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the period I explore, and then repeats itself in somewhat different ways, but has repeated itself in the opioid crisis. And it's certainly striking that these two cycles also correspond with kind of the cycles in the history of media technology, or with the introduction of new technologies of information and communication, the industrial print, and in the 19th century, the formation of mass media, and then the shift to the digital nowadays. And so yes, I definitely think that if you think about the history of these drug cycles, they should be interpreted more closely in connection with cycles in the history of media or media technology. So yes, I certainly agree with that. That's absolutely the sort of central interest in my own research. So the other question regarding what are the sort of policy prescriptions,
data scheduling regime.
Yes. Okay, that's interesting, and I suppose the kind of analogies I made, or the metaphor, I guess, which structures the paper, invites the question. I suppose scheduling of certain kinds of data certainly would reflect an awareness of the danger and the harms which uncontrolled circulation of data themselves could make. That's certainly what I'm trying to draw attention to. Scheduling at the same time suggests that the proper response would be to restrict access to that sort of data. And so I don't know. I think there's definitely a debate to be had whether that is the best solution. I do think the greatest dangers come from information asymmetries. The fact that the companies have access to certain data which the public and or the regulators do not. I think that probably creates the greatest danger. And so I guess you could envision two ways of responding to this as far as policy is concerned. And one would be, again, to restrict access to those data for the companies. And that's actually what, when the controversies arose about 20 years ago about, detailing and the use of, prescription tracking, the kind of data compiled and sold by IMS. There were a number of states who tried to pass laws to restrict access to this data, the sale of this data for commercial purposes. And those laws were struck down by the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court created a constitutional right to, to purchase and sell that kind of, prescription data. So that's not currently the law, but that was the attempt at the time, to restrict access to this data, restrict their circulation, and to try maybe, because those data also have, that's the whole point of it, that those data are kind of, have multiple uses or dual use, and they are collected also for research purposes, epidemiological purposes, which are important. So it's difficult, can you restrict access to this data for one purpose but not the other? And that was actually the argument of the Supreme Court, that the restrictions for this reason were problematic. So I don't know if restriction is the best way to go, but maybe another possibility is to broaden access to these data, and maybe make them accessible to to the broader public, who might also, as a result, these data contained all the evidence that the diversion was happening. The most striking set of data there was the ARCOS data, which is the DEA data database, where all the orders of controlled substances are filed, okay? And all the great reports that the Washington Post wrote, it could write because it got access to that database, but it had to go to court to force the DEA to release access to this database. So that's an interesting case in which the data, the ARCOS database is really quite similar to, just more complete, but it's quite similar to the chargeback data. And so those were data that the company and the regulators owned, but that the public was not aware of. And I think once journalists were able to get access to this, and they created great sort of interactive articles and and online newspapers, and you could really explore drugs, in your own neighborhood, like what are the pharmacies that have sold those drugs in large amounts, and just extraordinary resource, which really drew attention to, the fact that this system of delegated oversight, that the DEA delegates to company the responsibility of monitoring their own supply chains, just hasn't worked, right? So I think that's an interesting, certainly there's complications as to what data can and cannot be made and how it would be made accessible to the public. But, again, if you want to address information asymmetries, either you restrict access for the companies or you broaden access to the data that companies have to a broader public. So I find that solution somehow seductive. So I don't know. That's why the idea of data scheduling didn't come to my mind. But obviously it's a good question. So
solutions are always the hardest part. We have some questions from the Q&A. Let's take them in the order they arrived. The first one is from an anonymous attendee who asks, or who says, rebates to pharmacy benefit managers are typically larger than those to distributors. What have you learned about Mallinckrodt's negotiations with large pharmacy benefit managers like Medco, ESI, and Optum RX?
yes, that's a great question. I have to say I have not explored that aspect, but there's obviously a great deal of attention on these pharmacy benefits managers, and certainly there's plenty of records for that. But it's not the topic I focused on, and regrettably, it certainly is relevant to the story. But yeah, I have not systematically researched those records.
Forgive me if I
Obviously, they're very important in deciding, again, what particular generic is going to be chosen for what pharmacy, and so they're absolutely essential actors in this more uncharted territory, which we tried to start to sort of penetrate these middle sections of the pharmaceutical supply chain rather than the sort of endpoint, the prescribers. So yes, great question, and I hope others will.
The next question comes from, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Sergio Sismondo asks or says, brilliant study and article. You're focused on data. When Maud Bernison and I looked at these OIDA documents, we saw a related phenomenon, but in education. To satisfy the FDA's mandated risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, Mallinckrodt developed education initiatives that also served as marketing activities. Is this opportunism exactly what we should expect?
It's pervasive, yes, and I encountered some of those documents in my research too. I didn't research it it was not as central to my article as it was to yours, Sergio, and to Maud's. But yes, I saw those reports that the company had to file under the Sunshine Act to disclose all those payments to especially to its speakers in CME events, and IMS data is the kind of data used to determine whether Mallinckrodt always required that its speakers at those events, who then get the consultants fees and so on, have clinical experience with their products, meaning they have to be very big prescribers of the products themselves to be eligible for to become speakers at these CME events and get paid as a result. And the IMS data is what they used to determine which of those speakers met that clinical experience threshold. And I did see emails of certain former speakers for the company, people who had participated in these continuing medical education events, who were actually removed from the roster for insufficient prescribing of their drugs. So yeah, it was again the very pervasive pattern in the practice of the company.
We have another anonymous attendee who asks, Did the companies have explanations for why they didn't flag the suspicious data to the appropriate regulators? I'm assuming this is from just your observations of the court records. Again, the question is, did the companies have explanations for why they didn't flag the suspicious data to the appropriate regulators?
Um, yes, they had explanations. They actually, had to produce internal explanations when they monitored the supply chain. So there was an office of compliance which was headed by Karen Harper, and the depositions are in OIDA, so that gets discussed in great detail. But the way it worked is that the system is again a system in which the surveillance of the supply chain is delegated to the company. It's the company responsibility to create a system to identify suspicious orders and then to report them to the DEA. And chargeback data are the essential data they're expected to use in identifying those suspicious order. The way it worked is that, because of the language of the regulations and the law, if an order is suspicious, it has to be reported to the DEA. So to avoid having too many reports to the DEA, the company created two categories of the suspicious order and then the peculiar orders, which essentially are suspicious orders, but they're not called suspicious. So the company doesn't give itself the responsibility to notify the DEA. And then the way it worked is that once a peculiar order is placed, once through the chargeback data, you can see that pharmacies or distributors are starting to order drugs in unusual patterns and patterns that indicate possible diversion. Then Harper's office, the compliance office, would actually reach out to the account manager, to the salesperson that was responsible for managing the account. And they asked them, we have this suspicious order. Is there an explanation for the order? And then, the account managers themselves then responded and say, oh, yes, the just demand has gone up, or other, they're very frivolous kind of explanations, but they provide an explanation to kind of clear the order. And then, Harper's office basically systematically always accepted those explanations as, okay, since they're an explanation, then we can ship the order. And obviously the problem here is that the people who had to provide explanations for those peculiar orders were the same people who, were basically the sales force. So, who were paid depending on the amount of product they sold to these clients. So they had no interest in flagging those peculiar orders, upgrade them to suspicious order, and report them to the DEA. So yes, there were these internal explanations where the better explanations when the investigation started and the court cases started. Not really. I watched the deposition of Harper. She just describes the system, and there's no better explanations. So yes, that's what I found in there. Yeah.
So I just
Thanks for the link to the deposition.
I was going to say, to follow up to that point, one of our panelists posted to the chat a deposition from a compliance manager for everyone to click on and peruse.
Yes, that's Karen Harper, who I was mentioning. She was in charge of that office.
Precisely. I also I'm getting a note that we have one more here. I'm not sure if it's addressed to me or to Antoine, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, Antoine. Your framework of the quote unquote business as usual practices that contributed to the opioid crisis is interesting. Do you have ideas for other banal business practices that could be inspected in the archive?
I know of the work of some other colleagues, and something that's very interesting too, richly documented in the archive, is the work with of drug companies with organizations representing patients, and representing patients is very important. Advocating for patients is a very important role, but how those companies are funded, what their open or hidden conflicts of interest are, is very interesting. And again, there is a reason why patient advocacy organizations would want to work with companies. I think this enters in sort of business as usual or normal or reasonable business practice. But then when does it evolve into a situation where those organizations are basically fronts being co-opted for the marketing purpose of the company is an important one. And I think that's an example of something where the documents are incredibly revealing.
We have a little bit time left, and I was wondering if I could sneak one more question in. Something that was kind of absent, I think, from this particular story, but is kind of swarming around us, right, is the role of the government when it wants to enter into kind of a public partnership with Schedule II drugs. Um, so, for example, instead of leaving people to their own devices, actively promoting something. So, in this case, I'm thinking of the Health and Human Services Department, kind of, or the presidency, kind of opening their ears to psychedelic medicines being moved to Schedule II, or the broad promotion of GLP drugs. Um, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I remember there was the first of the Q&A webinars was incredible work there of the team who presented on the role of the VA in expanding access to opioids for VA for the VA. So yes, I mean they really showed that the archive has great documents about that. I have not myself researched it, but yes, others have identified it as, I think, a very interesting area of research for which the archive is, again, very rich. And yeah. Or was your question specifically about sort of the scheduling, like what categories should and who
Well,
should have a
I
say?
just wonder once these things, because these are your stories dealing with Schedule II drugs, and I'm kind of curious to see what these kind of incentives and operating modes would look like in these kind of new moments. I mean, we're reaching a point where there's a new career cycle for psychedelic drugs.
Mhm.
And I would just I love to be a fly on the wall for the psychedelic industry document archive.
Yes. Well, there's certainly, as far as the um, scheduling issue is concerned, certainly a very momentous decision is made when a substance in Schedule 1, then drops in Schedule 2. Schedule 1 is, normally in principle, there's drugs which have no medical uses. Um, Once they drop into Schedule 2, then, they're acknowledged to have this dual use, medical benefits, but also great potential, great potential for addiction. And then, but then once a drug drops into that category, then you can the whole sort of apparatus of the potent apparatus of marketing apparatus of the pharmaceutical industry can line up behind and propel the drug. I mean, to some degree, this is what we see with you know the questions that have arisen with marijuana, which is still, I think, Schedule 1, but is being considered for I guess a downgrading, but in practice it's already been so it's in a little bit in this kind of status. Should it be just tolerated, or should it become basically a drug that can be produced by the companies and where the full power of the of US like pharmaceutical industry marketing can be put behind, because that will definitely undoubtedly transform consumption patterns greatly, probably increase the consumption of those medications.
So we have run out of questions and we are running low on time. So I'd like to just share a way for folks to follow up on the work of the Industry Documents Archive. There's a QR code you can scan. You can also peruse some of the documents that some of our fellow panelists have posted in the chat for you all to explore. Um, if there are no more questions in the Q&A, I would just like to be the first and encourage everyone else to send their notes to Antoine Lentacker with any further questions or to thank him for his talk. And that's pretty much it. Thank you again, Dr. Lentacker, for spending your time with us. I know I enjoyed your paper and I enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to you about it.
Great. Thank you, Richard, and thanks to everyone who joined and helped organize the event. It was lovely.
Okay. I don't know if we should continue recording at this point.